Okay, so let's wrap up plant structures here by talking about the last group of plant tissues. So we talked about ground tissue and vascular tissue. So a parallel ground tissue is kind of like the muscles of the human body. Vascular tissue, kind of like the bloodstream, the arteries and the veins. The last tissue group to talk about will be the skin, or more appropriately, the dermal tissue. What covers the plant body? Think about the human body. We're covered with skin. We call it our dermis and epidermis to make up the skin. Well, plants have parallels. They have dermal tissue. That's what makes up this, we'll call it the skin of the plant. So you look at this picture here, and this is of a leaf structure. You have the cuticle up here, and then the upper epidermis. You have this palisade layer. Then down here you have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. You're going to have ground tissue, this light green-ish, I don't know what color to call it. This stuff in the middle here, there's your ground tissue, and then you have a little bit more of the lower epidermis and another layer of cuticle or dermal tissue down here. So I said keep in mind, or think about the parallels. Ground tissue is your muscle, vascular tissue is your arteries and veins, and dermal tissue is your skin. It's going to surround you. It's going to surround all of the plant structures, the roots, the stems, the shoots, the leaves, etc. So what we want to look at is all the different variation and components of dermal tissue. So dermal tissue comes in a couple varieties. First one to mention here is the epidermis. So the epidermis is the most superficial layer of the dermal tissue. Okay, the outermost layer. This is what we see on herbaceous plants. This, call it skin of the herbaceous plant. So in order for that plant to be successful, nutrients have to diffuse in, gases have to diffuse out, but it also has to be able to retain water. So quite often, the dermal tissue, let me do another box here. The dermal tissue will have a bunch of different components to it, different pieces and parts that vary based upon the plant structure as well as the plant types. But one part often seen in dermal tissue is the cuticle. The cuticle is a waxy layer, and its primarily goal is to prevent water loss. So that's that little pink color on the bottom of that image down there. So it helps retain water, keeps water within the leaves or within the cells of the plant so they don't lose water. But gases have to be exchanged. So quite often within the epidermis, we will see these little things called stoma, or call them stomata. And these are little openings that regulate gas exchange. So what will happen is the stomata or stoma will be open during good environmental conditions. Plenty of water, nice general temperatures, carbon dioxide diffuses in, and CO2 goes in, and oxygen diffuses out. If we're talking about a leaf, if we're talking about the root, you're not going to see stoma in the roots. You're not going to see stoma in the bark. This is primarily in the leaves or the green photosynthetic portions of the plants. So the stoma allow for the gas exchange. And as long as you have good environmental conditions, stoma are open. So now when environmental conditions get bad for most plants is hot and dry. the stoma close. But in order to close, they use these things called guard cells. So those guard cells are going to regulate the size of the opening of the stoma. During heat stress or hot and dry, the guard cells swell up and they actually close off the stoma to prevent water loss. That is the purpose and the primary function of those guard cells. They want to try to prevent water loss. So, like I said, when we look at the epidermis, we look at that superficial layer, we're going to see some of these features on different parts of the plant. We can see another feature known as trichomes. On different parts of the plants. Sometimes this is on the stem, sometimes it's on the leaves, just depends on the plant. What trichomes are tiny little hair-like structures. So they make the plant look fuzzy, hairy. In some cases, those trichomes are sharp, and they're there to help deter predation. Who's going to eat that stem there if it's got a bunch of stickers, little pointy things on it that hurt? Other times, trichomes are going to help collect and trap water that has evapotranspirated out of the plant. So what's going to happen here, this plant down here is called a lamb's ear, and it has hundreds of these tiny little hairs on it, and it actually feels soft. So if you guys see one of these, touch it, rub your hand on it. You often find them growing along the side of the road in the ditches, and it's soft. And look at the shape, that's why it's called lamb's ear. But those trichomes trap water. The increased surface area of the leaf, and as water evaporates out, it hits those little hairs, and another droplet hits the hair, and another droplet, and another droplet, and then those droplets collect, and it drips back down towards the root system. So it's a great adaptation for plants to retain or try to collect as much water as possible so it doesn't lose too much water during drier times of the year. So we often see this early morning, go look at one of these and you're like, oh, it looks like it rained. That's not water from rain on those leaves. It's actually water that was evaporating out of the plant that the trichomes caught and are trying to return back to the root system of the plant. Okay, so those are some of the structures and components of what we call the epidermis of, of the plant. Now, some plants, the woody plants, develop a thing called the periderm. So the periderm, a little bit different here. We're going to see a change in the game. The periderm, get that. Okay, so the periderm replaces the epidermis. Oh, let me fix our font. It's going to replace the epidermis in woody plants. This is what we're going to call a bark. Okay, so if you guys went out, grabbed a twig or a branch or something that had bark on it, rub it, feel it. You're feeling the periderm. Epidermis is primarily associated with herbaceous plants. Periderm is what we're going to talk about with the woody plants. And what we'll see is underneath that layer of bark, that superficial layer, will be these things called cork cells. Now, cork cells are going to be dead cells at maturity that contain a waterproofing substance. This is called suberin. This helps prevent water loss. So you have a layer of dead cells there in the bark and a waterproofing layer. It's hopefully going to trap moisture within your tissue and your cells. So this layer, like I said, this layer right here, it's all dead cells, dead tissue. So it's kind of like a skin. Think about back to the human skin. Look at your calluses. Those are all dead cells. And there's keratin in there that helps prevent water loss and tries to protect the body. That's the equivalent of what periderm is doing for the plant, is trying to protect the plant, decrease water loss through that part of the plant. All right, so again, I want you guys to remember across the vascular plants, we will see these three groups of tissues: ground, vascular, and dermal. Each plant group has evolved slightly different adaptations and features and functions of these groups to work a little differently. It's what makes them unique, makes them different, but also enables them to survive in different ecological roles and different environments. So, okay. All right. So last little bit to mention here, we want to talk a little bit about growth. So primary growth of plants. When plants are growing, they start out with what we call the primary growth. And what we're going to see is primary growth occurs, get another box. It occurs from apical meristems. So there's meristem tissue. And when it's called apical meristem, this is going to be the tissue that is at the tips of the roots and the shoots. So apical enables growth upwards, makes the plant taller, or the roots deeper into the ground. So the challenge or concern here is, if you look at this image below, we have a bud of apical meristem here, and is protected by these little leaf buds. So leaf buds wrap around this sensitive growing tissue and protect it during the winter. Now, leaf buds open up when they're triggered by temperature, and they open up, and that should allow the apical meristem shoot to elongate. The problem is, if these leaf buds open up because it was 60 degrees in January, and then it drops down to 20 degrees later in January, and it freezes that apical meristem, you may not have growth off of that part of the plant. So this is where climate change is screwing up plants big time, because they're responding to warmer weather going, hey, time to start growing, and then they get frozen, and it actually stunts their growth, causes huge physiological problems with some plants because of how climate change is happening. This is why sometimes an orchard won't have any fruit, because of a polar vortex during the winter that just froze out all the little buds that were going to turn into peaches or to other types of fruit. So think about the economic impact that that has if an entire peach orchard doesn't produce in a year because of climate change. You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars of revenue loss, and there's nothing that farmer can do to prevent that because it's climate change, which is a entire social challenge here. So, okay, so that's apical meristem. The lateral meristems is going to be growing tissue that makes plants wider. It makes them thicker, grows outward to create girth of the plant. So different tissue group, growth in a different direction, but same concept. Growing living tissue. So root systems are constantly growing unless they go into a period of dormancy. So it's why root systems are often used for research and studying. So, okay, so that's primary growth. The other type of growth to mention here is what we call secondary. So secondary growth is going to be something that, whoa, gotta keep those there, that we see happening in generally or primarily this is going to be occurring in woody plants. So think about your trees. If you guys have a little piece of twig and you can peel back the bark layer, you have this outer bark layer. Again, this is all dead tissue. Then you have an inner bark layer. Then you get into the living tissue. This is a vascular cambium. And then you get into the wood part of the tree, which is known as a secondary xylem. So you got your xylem and phloem here, and then your epidermal or dermal tissue here as the bark. So what we'll see is every year the vascular cambium is producing another layer and another layer and another layer of phloem, xylem, and phloem. These in woody plants give us growth rings. So you can get a rough idea of the age of a plant, a woody plant, by counting the rings. So you go, oh, well, there's 47 rings there. That tree was roughly 47 years old. So it not only can tell us age, those growth rings and how they grew, how big they are, did they have problems, etc., tells us about environmental conditions that that plant has experienced during the period of its lifetime. So take a big piece of tree ring or any board where you can see the grain of the wood. That's what we call a grain here. And count. Start at the center, count outward, and it tells you how old that tree was. What has it experienced throughout its life? You know, this is when it germinated as a seedling, and then so many years old, and then it got injured here, and then it got shaded here. It had a dry couple years of drought, a couple years of lots of rain. Oh, shoot, it got burned by a fire this many years ago, and so on. Incredible amount of history in these tree rings. Think about, we have trees in Illinois, not many of them left, but we have some trees in Illinois that were here before the United States became a country. They're over 300 years old. Imagine the history in that tree, what it has experienced and witnessed in its lifetime. Now imagine finding a fossilized tree that's millions of years old. We can learn about the environment millions of years ago by looking at these things. So lots of information can be obtained by looking at plants. We can learn about all sorts of environmental factors, what's going on in ecosystems. The goal here is making sure we're a little more comfortable and more knowledgeable about plant structure, plant growth, the tissues associated with it, and how do we use these things for our welfare.